Hello, I am here at Crystal Cove Historic District, and I am going to be talking about the Intertidal Zone, more specifically our rocky shoreline communities. Starting off, rocky shorelines take up the majority of our coastlines at roughly 75%, three quarters, and they are primarily formed from things like active volcanoes or subduction of the tectonic plates, or just anything that adds more landmass to the crust, basically adding more rock. And some major characteristics of the rocky shorelines are things like, again, the rocky, hard, non-moving substrate, and this allows for a very densely packed and diverse organisms to all just kind of live in this area. It is also heavily influenced by things like the tides and wave action that are seen here. So starting off with the ecology of the rocky shores, we're going to be taking a look at the physical factors and some of these physical factors that determine where these organisms can potentially live. These are things like tolerance to air, or like how long they can stay out of water for. Its ability to prevent desiccation or drying up from the direct sunlight beating down on it. Also things like substrate structure. So again, yeah, these are hard substrate, but also depends on the actual shape of that substrate that could either allow organisms to latch onto or some fish to kind of swim in between as shelter. And then also things like wave action, or like how heavy wave action beats down on this environment, or if there's none at all. These are all factors that can determine where these organisms can live on these rocky shorelines. And then there's also biological factors that determine where organisms actually live in this rocky shoreline. And these factors are basically just competition. So competition for space for some organisms where they might have to fight each other to take hold of a certain part of their environment. There's also competition for food and what type of food's available that organisms might have to compete over. And also just basically predation. Some organisms predate on others, or other ones predate on different kinds, a whole food web. So with these physical and biological factors that can determine where these organisms live, there's also some adaptations that can be seen on some of these organisms that allow them to be able to live in some of these conditions for longer than others. Some of these factors are things like different mollusks having lighter shades of their shells that reflect more sunlight and therefore reflects less heat onto them. And some organisms or mollusks can actually rotate their shells to stay aligned with the sun to reduce the surface area of the sun beating directly down on it. That also helps to prevent. An example of an organism that does exhibit this type of a characteristic could be something like the knobby periwinkle. These mollusks have lighted colored shells that allows for light to reflect and heat to reflect off of them, and that they use their mucus threads to kind of adjust their position on the harder substrate to either reduce the surface area of the sun beating on them, or to kind of adjust themselves to be not on hot rock. Because since they are higher up on the rocky shorelines, that means that there would be more exposure to both air and also more sunlight. So it makes sense that this organism does exhibit this type of characteristic. Some other major ways that organisms adapted to be able to live in this area, like from physical factors, are organisms that are capable of just moving straight into like shelter just to protect themselves from air exposure, sun exposure, and just hard wave action. So some organisms basically can become more dorsally flattened to protect themselves and hold onto the hard substrate from waves constantly beating on them. Or things like crabs could just move into just shaded areas of the rock, or some other mollusks that kind of form cavities into the rock to protect themselves. So along with that, with biological adaptations here, is that on rocky shorelines, there's almost every kind of predators. So there's grazers, there's filter feeders, there's detritivores, all living together in this area that all predate on their respective food sources. And it is here that some organisms are capable of actually adapting to that by exhibiting different levels of zonation. So some organisms aren't capable of living so high up on the rocky shorelines. So there becomes like a type of layer of one kind of organism that kind of take over that one layer, because if they go any lower, another organism is able to live up there and kind of prey upon them. Whereas organisms above them might be too dry or too hot for organisms to move up higher, so they kind of just take over specific parts of the rocky shorelines. And then some factors that can determine where or which level of zonation that some organisms live on could be things like the slope of the shoreline or the wave action, or like how heavy the waves beat on it. And then there's also the tidal ranges, like how often or how big of a range the tides are fluctuate on these shorelines. Those could be major factors that could determine which level or how high or how low some organisms live on these rocky shorelines. So with these different levels of zonation that can be seen on these rocky shorelines, some examples of different levels of which organism lives where could be seen. So an example would be at the upper or splash zone of the intertidal. This is primarily where things like lichen or just some more of type barnacle type organisms live. So you can see kind of here, I'm on the upper zone. Not a whole lot here, but you can see different types of small barnacles, just little things kind of clipped onto the rock, kind of all dried up. But over here you have different types of algae kind of growing. So this is commonly seen on the upper splash zone of the intertidal zone, rocky shorelines. And then just below that to the mid intertidal zone, that's where you see start more mussels, more cnidarians like with sea anemones, and also maybe some like crabs. A lot more diverse of organisms are more in the mid intertidal zone. I am currently here when it's kind of a higher tide, so I can't exactly show specifically because otherwise I'll get wet. And then there's the low intertidal zone or subtidal zone. That's where like some more kelp live. That's where some more ochre stars are commonly seen. They're more lower on the level of the rocky shores intertidal zone. Another thing with the intertidal zone is that there's things of tide pools that are commonly seen. And it is these tide pools that allow for shelter for some organisms to go back into the water where they might have been caught at low tide and they might not be able to get back to the ocean. And it is these tide pools that allow them to go back into the water to shelter themselves from desiccation and just go back into the water where they might reside in. But it is with these tide pools, and if it's a low tide, these heavily fluctuate like the water quality. So the water temperature might be higher. The pH could be drastically different than what is normally seen in the water of the ocean. And then the salinity. So if it's the tide pool's hotter, the water is evaporating, making the tide pool in that small inclusive environment to have a higher salinity. And each tide pool might actually exhibit completely different types of environments, where one tide pool might have like a crab that might dominate that for the time being until the tide comes back up, whereas another one might have a bunch of sea anemones. Each one would then competing each other for space or for the sources of food that might be in it, and then also have to adapt to the wildly different qualities, water qualities or parameters in there. So with that being the more background of the intertidal communities here on the rocky shorelines, some of the primary organisms that can be commonly seen, for example, here at the historic district, are sea anemones, which are cnidarians, some more many different species of mussels, but the commonly seen one is just the standard clam. And then there's also some commonly seen ochre stars that I've seen that are pretty common here. That's more of the lower down. And then there's also crustaceans like crabs, swimming crabs, or just fiddler crabs are also commonly seen around here. Each one kind of exhibit their own niche here. So like the crabs, they're a little bit more of a predator here, where they kind of scrounge around, kind of use their little claws to kind of pick apart anything that they might find. And sea anemones are more of a filter feeder. They are commonly seen fighting each other over pieces of rock to kind of anchor themselves down to. Again, example of competition for space. And they do this because some areas might actually have a flow of food or nutrients that pass by that more often than other. So they actually fight each other for specific places on the rocky substrate. Then there's ochre stars. These ochre stars are commonly considered as a keystone species here because they are such a top predator. These ochre stars, they are more in the mid to low intertidal zone of zonation, and these guys, they primarily eat upon like things like the mussels and more clams that are down there, and also sea urchins. They kind of just stick out their stomach into these organisms and kind of eat them from the inside out. Then there's also just the standard mussels, or just like mollusks that are seen here, like clams, different types of shellfish. These guys are really common here, and they are all over the mid intertidal zone. You can see them all out there. I'm caught more of at a rising tide, so I can't exactly go out there. But those guys, their kind of niche is to basically try to take over as much space as possible. And these guys are mainly just filter feeders as well. They kind of eat anything that kind of flows into them, any form of like nutrients or food, and then they are the primary food source for the ochre stars again. So there's constant competition for space between these ochre stars and these different mussels and clams. Now, with all that, of these rocky intertidal communities, there's also the potential risk of damage to them caused by humans, us. Things like tourism or just a more industrial infrastructure that might demolish these diverse ecosystems. Like, for example, me, I'm right here. I'm walking around this intertidal zone. I could potentially accidentally be causing some harm to many of these organisms that I might not initially realize. I might step onto a tide pool and squish something. So human interaction with these tide pools are very common and could cause potential negative effects to these ecosystems. So that is, of course, something that we have to be pretty considerate about to help preserve these pretty cool ecosystems. And it's with these human interaction on these intertidal zones that many places have put certain policies in place. Like, for example, here at the historic district, this is part of an MPA, a marine protected area, that's enforced by many of the surf and wildlife people. So they always come by, make sure people aren't drastically harming the environment, and just generally keeping this ecosystem in order, or just like in the natural state of things. So with all of that, I believe that this brings a conclusion about the ecological profile of the Rocky Intertidal Zone. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know if I accidentally missed some key details. I probably did. I was accidentally caught more at a higher tide, but yeah, thank you for watching.